The Diary of Elizabeth H. Platt. The account of her journey from New York to Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1836 with her mother, Sarah Esther Henshaw, including a visit among the Winnebago Indian tribes. The Diary of Elizabeth Henshaw Platt is read by Kathy Gittleson.
Chapter 5. Niagara to Cleveland. The morning came, and I was prostrate from headache, so that I had only energy sufficient to prepare myself for the stage to Buffalo by 9 o'clock. Our road lay, for the most part, on the banks of the river, but I was too ill to enjoy its beauties. We passed through the villages of Tonawanda and Black Rock, and reached Buffalo 20 miles from Niagara at about 2 o'clock. Having dined and dressed, we walked around the city. It contains 20,000 inhabitants and is a place of much business, with some very pretty dwellings. But the country is too level to be interesting. Towards evening, Mr. Daniel Whitney, nephew of our brother, who is to be our beau to Green Bay, was announced, much to Mother's joy. She caught his hand and seemed unwilling to release it for fear he would fly away from her. But he assured her that he would not desert her, and she was pacified and suffered him to leave her for the evening. The drawing-room of the Eagle is warmed by a good fire this first day of September, or we should be shivering with cold. We have miserable accommodations here, dirty rooms and inattentive chambermaids. There are several young ladies in the drawing-room who appear to enjoy themselves, but they are strangers to us, and we form our own party, speculating upon who they may be. Friday, September 2nd. Awoke in the morning at the miserable Eagle Tavern, but refreshed by a good night's sleep. I thought of the world of waters over which we were now to take our dangerous path, committed our bodies to a machine which bears in its very bosom the elements of death, fire being the demon or the angel, let the reader choose, by which it is propelled. But to the keeping of Israel's God, of my God, did I commit us, and felt that he would direct our course in perfect safety, that he, our most kind and most indulgent Father, would give us the guidance of our back to his angels, would hold the waters in the hollow of his hand, and although disposed to range, would say to them, "Peace, be still." How delightful it is to feel that the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God is our Father, and our compassionate and indulgent friend, that the holiest and most endearing earthly affection cannot unfold to us 1,000th part of his tenderness which he feels towards his erring but repentant and confiding children. If ye, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more, yes, how much more, shall your heavenly Father give his Holy Spirit to them that ask him. The morning was clear, but before it was time to go to the boat, it commenced raining. Soon after breakfast, we thought it was but prudent to secure our places in our floating home, and left the house in an omnibus, full to overflowing, in the midst of clouds and storm. No very promising presage for the tempestuous waters of Lake Erie. Poor Miss Cooper, who is to go with us to Green Bay, and to whom we have introduced ourselves, was still waiting for her sleeping brother Beale before she could take her breakfast as a preliminary to departure. I endeavored to prevail upon her to go down without him, but she declined. The pretty Miss Schermerhorn, to whom we had brought a letter of introduction from Anne Babcock, stood bonneted and plaided, looking from the window with an expression which seemed to say, "Why don't he come?" But we left them and wended our way to the Michigan, which we soon gained sight of with its ponderous framework, its peopled decks, its huge machinery pouring forth clouds of smoke, and its ample bow, now enlivened with strains of instrumental music which came over the waters in softened melody. As we were stepping on board, I heard the exclamation, "Why, Miss Henshaw!" and looked up, perceived that my mother's hand was grasping one of the Doolittles, not of the Joel race, however, for this man's movements seemed to have belied his name, inasmuch as he graduated but the 3rd Wednesday of last month, a few days since, at Middlebury College, and lo, he is now upon the waters of Lake Erie, going in pursuit of fortune or fame, or haply both. Mother looked up with an air which seemed to say, "One of my Buffalo customers, I believe." And this reminds me of an incident which has been omitted in the proper place, but it's too good to lose. While we were at Schenectady, and I was sleeping and Mother eating, or rather shortly after she arose from the table, she espied the lips of our former friend and neighbor Burge, the Middlebury shopkeeper, who removed about a year ago to Buffalo, coming like an avant courier some distance in advance of a sober physiognomy. With that feeling of delight and recognition with which we hail any well-known features in a foreign land and which makes even those of a dog expressive and delightful, she seized his hand, exclaiming, while she gave it a most hearty grasp, "Mr. Burge, how do you do?" "One of my Buffalo customers, I believe," replied he, his eyes standing out like lobsters and looking up at her animated countenance with the most chilling sang-froid. A shock like this was too much for the old lady, and she did not reveal the mortifying circumstance to me, which amounts for its not finding a place among these pages at the proper time. Mr. Doolittle made himself known, and Mother was glad to see him and to hear from Middlebury, still our home, although we have wandered so widely from it. McClure and Harriet came on board with us, but found such crowds of living beings heaped upon with trunks, bags, boxes, etc., that they soon made good their retreat and stationed themselves in a store opposite, while I stationed myself in front of the musicians, where we could mutually catch the language of the eye, although we lost that from the lip. The rain ceased, and passenger after passenger came thronging to the deck. At length one appeared with a lady leaning upon his arm. He was very tall, sandy hair and complexion, green spectacles and a white hat, majestic enough to be a hero, but not handsome. It is he, spoke the eyes of my brother and sister. Est-ce possible? Is this the night of many romance of my unromantic sister Fanny? He, the elegant, the interesting Lieutenant D, of whom I have heard so much? Well, peace to his heart, though others it be. I still stood upon the deck watching the herds of newcomers and dwelling upon the bright and blooming face of my younger sister, with those last looks which so loved to gaze and linger, while the engines of two boats, one on each side of me, were belching forth their volleys of steam alternately, now whiz, whiz on this side, then buzz, buzz on the other, with a hissing and tremendous noise like the bursting of 100 skyrockets or the congregated voices of 1,000 snakes. At length the passenger arrived, the last trunk was taken on board, the last kiss was wafted, and the last look exchanged, when Michigan turned her gigantic prow to the broad lake and breasted its waves with firm and majestic bearing. Her course was steady, and she bore herself nobly and proudly over the bright green waters. But as we advanced, the wind increased, and the white foam came rolling towards us upon the summit of every wave, bearing to our ears the sullen and impatient murmurs of the spirit of the waters. Oh, how the scene was changed! From the gay Michigan, whose colors were floating gracefully in the breeze, the waters reposing at her feet, and music issuing from her bosom, to the immense machine plowing the foamy deep, chafed by its fretting waves and carrying sickness and dismay to the stomachs and hearts of its lady passengers. The cabin was filled with groans of distress, the chambermaid busy as ever Calem Quotem was, flying first this way and then that, babies mewling and crying in their mother's arms, ladies fainting and cascading, intermingled with sighs and groans and tears. This interesting drama, with very little variety of scene, was continued through the day. My poor mother sick she lay in her berth, not daring to eat or drink or even vary her apparel as night approached. I was not so badly off, but endeavored to keep my mind occupied and diverted with reading and journalizing and conversation. I would not deliver the introduction to Miss Schermerhorn because I did not feel like doing the agreeable, but have become somewhat acquainted with her, as also with Miss Cooper, Mr. and Mrs. Davies, and Mr. Beale, and a Colonel McCarthy from Virginia. This last is a very intelligent but an egotistical man, and converses much about his love for children. He has lost 3 boys out of 4, he told me. Did they die in infancy, sir? One died at 6 months old, and one at 9 years, remarkable for his beauty and talent. And were I to live to be as old as Methuselah, madam, I could never lose the recollection or the pain of my bereavement. But I cannot, and would not, have them back again. They are in better hands than mine. My remaining boy of 14 years old plays well upon the flute and violin, writes poetry very agreeably, and is the best scholar of his age in the United States. His body is as fragile as his mind is premature. I have brought him to Saratoga Springs that he may throw up his books and endeavor to find health and strength by relaxation, but a prepossession has taken hold of me, which I can neither resist nor lie, that I am to survive my children. He has but the one boy, and a little girl of 3 years old, who is also wonderfully precocious. The colonel spoke of himself as having been once the subject of almost unforgivable passions, but reflection had taught him the necessity of controlling them, and he said, "There is now no man either in the church or out of the church who has more self-command than I." He lives in a little village, and such is his love for children and their regard to him, that he says when he returns from one of his long journeys, they cluster around his house in herds, and he receives them all and speaks kindly to them, whether he has risen from his bed or not. This colonel is a most singular-looking genius, and when I first saw him, I was almost frightened. He was leaning upon a gun, of immense stature, swarthy complexion, and his dark hair about a foot long lay in waves upon his brawny shoulders, while a dark shag coat completed the rough picture. I took him at least for one of the aborigines, and was much surprised when told it was a wealthy, intelligent, and accomplished Colonel McCarthy. I have since heard a free thinker in religion and a libertine in morals. At 7 we separated from the deck where our little coterie had been collected and went down to occupy our narrow berths. I have a stateroom with Miss Cooper, and confined it is still more tolerable than the crowded cabin. Saturday morning. We have had a night of more comfort than I feared. I have been repeatedly wakened by the ringing of the bell announcing the stopping of the boat, and then I have listened anxiously for the rushing steam, that terrific sound, although it speaks of safety. I could but commend myself and mine renewedly to the care of Him who never slumbers or sleeps, and felt reassured by the recollection of His love and goodness. We are nearing Cleveland, having passed Erie, Dunkirk, Fairport, and Ashtabula in the night. We landed at the wharf in Cleveland at about 9:30, and before we could make any arrangements for going ashore, Sister Emmeline and her husband and William Cleveland came on board. I instantly went with Emmeline to aid Mother in throwing on her outer garments for the land, but we found the poor old lady with her head still over the bowl and still retching and vomiting as if she had but just commenced. I thought of the poor man in the fable and the song of the persecuted boy, head, gall, liver, lights, and all. A hard life to her she finds this upon the waters, and so reckless has it made her of appearances that when I first went upon deck this morning, I found her there in the midst of this gentleman, unwashed, uncombed, and unwigged, with her frosty locks escaping from beneath the folds of her nightcap, and her bonnet just tossed on, looking like Patience on a monument, not smiling at grief, but thinking upon her privations with a very careworn and saddened visage. As soon as she could, after the boat was fairly anchored, we placed her in a carriage, and climbing in ourselves, drove through the principal street of the town to Mr. Cleveland's residence. His wife welcomed us very kindly, got us some nice cakes and crackers, and urged us to remain in Cleveland and visit her. We were strongly inclined to do so, more particularly as Sister Emmeline is debating whether she will not travel east with her husband instead of going directly west, as we anticipated, with us. The convention of the Diocese of Ohio is to convene here next Thursday, and this circumstance would add much to the interest of the sojourn here. A change came o'er the spirit of our dream. During the few hours of the stay of the Michigan in Cleveland, Sister Emmeline was prevailed upon by the advice of Mother and myself, combined with her own inclinations, to go to New York with her husband, and during a ride around the pretty village politely furnished us by Mr. Cleveland, we concluded also to change our purposes, abide with him and keep house in his wife's absence during the sittings of the convention, then go and visit Sister Margaret at Gambier, and meet Mr. and Mrs. Whitney at Huron to take the boat for Green Bay, about the 10th of October. In order to do this, we hastened to the boat to obtain such of our luggage as we would need. We took one trunk, box, and carpet bag, and left the remainder in charge of Mr. D. Whitney, Jr., our polite and attentive beau, gave the parting hand to our new acquaintances and agreeable companions du voyage, who expressed much regret at losing us, and rode up the hill again to Mr. Cleveland's, myself rejoicing in spirit to be once more on the firm earth and away from the sickening, although beautiful waters. We called in our side at the doors of Mr. Leonard and Mr. Sargent, were most cordially welcomed by the wives of both gentlemen, and urged to give a portion of our time to them. Emmeline and her husband spent the remainder of the day with us. Mr. Whitney had put up a barrel of peaches for us to eat on the voyage, which would await us at Detroit, and a box also, which he brought with him to Cleveland. This we opened incontently, and found the inside more attractive than the exterior. They were the first peaches we have seen that were edible, and we therefore devoured them without mercy, calling upon our friends to aid us. In the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Leonard and Mr. and Mrs. Sargent and Mrs. Sterling, a beautiful woman, came to see us. At 8, Sister Emmeline and her husband took leave to go on board for a steamboat for the East, and ourselves, wearied and exhausted, went to bed. We arose refreshed on Sunday morning, glad to be relieved from the motion of the boat which had pursued us, even after we had been hours on land. The day was bright and beautiful, and as we passed through the pleasant streets of Cleveland in order to go to the courts of the Lord, I could not but exult at the contrast of the situation in which I was, and that in which I expected to be. And taking all things into consideration, it was not a very unwelcome digression from our intended route. At all events, vastly more agreeable than the thought of proceeding onward to Green Bay as strangers during the absence of my sister Emmeline. We heard Mr. Boyden preach, and though not as eloquent as I had been led to anticipate from the reports, I should think he might be very useful and acceptable parish priest. In the afternoon after church, Mr. Sargent came in to inform us that his father and sister, Mrs. Wainwright, had just arrived from Middlebury, which we were delighted to hear, and could not but wonder at the singularity of the providence which had congregated so many from one portion of the earth to another so remote from it, without any particularly gravitating cause. On Monday morning we were called on the newly arrived at an early hour. They appeared overjoyed to see us. The old gentleman, whom at home we do not speak to, once in a century scarcely, caught us by both hands, exclaiming, "I am dreadful glad to see you," manifesting his joy at the same time by the most vociferous peals of laughter. We were delighted to see them also, for they were directly from the land of our hearts and our home. They had recently breathed the pure air of our mountains. They had within a few days looked upon the faces we love. We deluged them with questions, and after I had all my queries satisfied, I retired to the back room to read a letter from my dear friend Mrs. Wood, brought by them to Mrs. W. Sargent. She speaks in it very kindly and affectionately of me, and I love her for the love she bears me. From Mr. Sargent's we proceeded to Mr. Leonard's, where we passed the day very pleasantly with his family. Elizabeth Wells says her health is much better in Ohio than it was in Vermont, although she still looks miserably. Mrs. Sargent's youngest child of 8 months is a most beautiful child. Her hair is soft and luxuriant and lays in rich curls all over her head and brows. Mr. Sargent's family with the newcomers joined us in the afternoon, and we formed a complete Middlebury circle of 10 or 12. During the afternoon, Elizabeth Wells and myself took a walk through the principal streets of Cleveland, calling in our way on Mrs. Brooks, another Vermont acquaintance. The town is prettily laid out and commands an extensive and pleasant view of the broad waters of the Erie. It contains 6,000 inhabitants and is a place of much business. On Monday night, Mrs. Cleveland left for Vermont, and I am to supply her place as a housekeeper. Tuesday morning I busied myself a little in the kitchen in my new department, assisting Elizabeth Firth, who is also a Middleburian, in domestic details. In the afternoon, we visited Mrs. W. Sargent and had a most luxurious entertainment at her hospitable board. We could almost fancy ourselves in Vermont, as we see none scarcely but Vermont faces. On Wednesday, Dr. Milner of New York arrived, and Mrs. Cleveland brought him home to dine and abide at his house during the sittings of convention. In the evening, we went to church, and as we were going in, met Brother Fitch, who had just arrived from Gambier. He brings tidings of the weal of Sister Margaret and her household. Mr. Brooke of Cincinnati preached well and eloquently, and Brother Fitch and Mr. Dyer of Gambier went to Mr. Cleveland's to abide with us. On Thursday evening, the convention sermon was preached by the bishop to a very large and most attentive congregation. It was a splendid discourse. He adverted in terms of severe reprehension to the new measures, so exceedingly popular at the present day, and spoke of our own beloved church and her purity, simplicity, and dignity as a defense against the outbreaks of wild fanaticism, and as a safe and sacred asylum for truth amid the storms of distension, hearsay, and schism, which are distracting and dividing the distant churches. He exhorted his clergy to defend the bulwarks of their faith, to secure the outposts, but to see especially that the fire was burning upon the altar. Mrs. Wainwright declared herself delighted, much to my surprise, recollecting her admiration of Mr. Burchart. And Friday, to my astonishment, Mr. Thompson made his appearance. He called in the morning and called in the evening, and on Saturday he came after dinner and sat 2 or 3 hours with us. On Saturday evening, after we had taken tea at Mr. Sterling's, Thomas and all, he having been waylaid as he was going to see us at Mr. Cleveland's, and persuaded in the whole company, went in a body to hear Dr. Milner preach a missionary sermon, I alone remaining home to take care of the baby, that Elizabeth might go to church. It was something of a self-denial for me, but she was desirous to go, and I therefore should have thought myself wrong not to make the sacrifice. It is our duty to think of the privations of servants, and regard their own improvement and pleasure, as well as our own, rendering unto them that which is just and kind for the Lord's sake, remembering that we have a Master also in heaven. On Sunday morning I rose and attended the 6 o'clock prayer meeting holden in church, quite ashamed that I had loved my ease and indulgence so much as not to have attended them before. The prayers were all extemporaneous, with the exception of the first one, and this manner of conducting them, I am told, has given umbrage to some of the Ohio clergy who were for adhering to the book at all times and under all circumstances in the house of God. On Sunday morning the bishop preached again, and gave an address to the clergy of a most impressive and admirable character. After the sermon 15 were ordained, 3 as deacons and 12 as presbyters, and after that the communion was administered to a multitude of recipients. It was a very interesting season. At noon Mr. Thompson again called, and to my great sorrow said he had been too unwell to go to church, and therefore had not heard this most sound and excellent sermon of the Bishop McIlvain's. In the afternoon the Episcopal clergy were divided round to preach in the several houses of public worship. The day has been one of unusual interest, and I hope it may result in essential and extensive good to the Church of God, which he has bought with his own blood.
End of chapter 5.